If you're like most folks Dr. Kris Fusterhausen works with, you're active, you want to take ownership of your health, and you want to age gracefully. The problem is there is so much conflicting information out there about health and wellness, it's tough to know who to trust. Most providers are limited by what insurance will approve, so it can seem like they're only able to help you manage your health decline with more meds. On the Dr. Kris Life podcast, you'll learn how you can regain your confidence in your health journey. You'll learn helpful knowledge about programs, supplements, peptides, and hormones that Dr. Kris has used with thousands of patients just like you to help them crush their goals and be their best selves. So if you're ready to take charge of your health and are wanting to stay active and healthy so you can be a better parent, partner, or lover, then you're in the right place. Welcome to the Dr. Kris podcast. Dr. Kris, welcome back to the Dr. Kris Life podcast.
Hi, how are you today?
I'm excellent, Dr. Kris. The other day, I'm going to tell you a little story. The other day, I had a procedure. And of course, you got to go see the doctor before that, and then you show up for the procedure and later. But it was interesting because they always ask me, who's your primary provider, right? And I don't know why that kind of messes me up, but it's like, why do they ask when I don't think they really talk to each other anyway? Because if I go to the primary physician, which is basically one of those drive-in things, you go for it as I got a cold or I need a physical or something. They don't talk to each other. Why do they ask that?
Well, so technically what's most likely going to happen after your procedure is the specialist is going to do some sort of a note to the primary care physician. So whether it makes it there, whether or not the primary care physician actually looks at it, that's debatable. I can't tell how many times that I've, the patient goes and gets a colonoscopy. They come back to my office. Hey, did you get my colonoscopy report? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But that's typically what's behind that question is that at least in theory, they have the plan on sending a note to your provider, your primary care provider.
It bothers me because if I go see the primary care, every time I see them, they want me to list out all my procedures I had in the past 50 years or something. I don't remember those. I don't even know how to spell half of those procedures, right? And then you go in and you get the colonoscopy or whatever, and then they're asking you, do you have your labs, or when's the last time you had labs? And I'm going, and is it really up to me? I guess need to figure out how to manage all of my healthcare conversations with my physicians.
Yeah, unfortunately, in that setting, you pretty much have to be your own advocate, right? It kind of is up to the patient to make sure that the primary care provider has not only received that type of information, but has actually reviewed it. It's very common. Let's say you go and you have an appendectomy, right? Emergency appendectomy, and maybe there's a note sent from the surgeon to the doctor. Well, then most of the time the doctor is so busy, they quickly look at it. Oh, okay, Steve Brown had an appendectomy. He lived. They file it away. They move on. They don't take the time to actually update your chart, which would be a good thing to do, right? Like, okay, let's go put in Steve's chart that on August 8th of 2022, he had an appendectomy, so that when you come back in, the staff is like, oh, you had an appendectomy on August 8th. It just doesn't happen the vast majority of time. And it goes back to that issue that I talk about is that these primary care physicians in the traditional model are so busy. They're so inundated with paperwork. They have good intentions. I'm not knocking them. I did the same thing back in the day. I'd have 50 of those things that get dumped in my mailbox every day, my email box, or my EMR, my electronic medical record inbox, and you're just going through it, what's important, what's not. And then, as you come and see every patient, they sometimes get frustrated, hey, what have you had done since the last time you're here? Well, hell, you should have read the records. I had an appendectomy, but you can't remember those things. But there is this common perception that is out there with patients, at least I think there is, that, okay, my doctor, my primary care doctor sent me to a cardiologist. They sent me to let's say they're having shortness of breath. Let's just throw out a scenario. They're having shortness of breath, and the doctor, the primary care physician, despite being a great clinician, isn't 100% sure what's wrong. So they send you to the pulmonologist, they send you to the cardiologist, and they get workups done. And there's this perception, I believe, that somehow there's this great powwow that occurs between the primary care physician, the pulmonologist, the cardiologist, when most of the time those, not only is not two of those physicians talking, but for sure three of them aren't talking, unless it's really bad. I always find that's about the only time that the specialists talk, is when they find something really bad. Okay, like, oh my God, I'm the pulmonologist, I scoped Steve's lungs and I found a big mass and I think it's cancer. Well, then sure, they start communicating then. Okay, but if it's mild abnormalities, they write up what they think should be done. They write prescriptions, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily wrong. It's just the way it is, but that's how mistakes happen, because you have physicians doing things without the direct knowledge of what other physicians are doing. And unfortunately, a lot of patients are not always well educated on what to tell those providers. They forget, oh yeah, I forgot that this doctor wrote these 3 prescriptions and I didn't tell you, and it didn't get updated into the chart. And it's one of the reasons that I think that what we do can be sometimes, of course, probably lots of the times, can be a more advantageous way of treating patients. And that is a doctor that simply has more time to spend with you, has more time to work with the other specialist, can stay on top of what's going on with these guys and girls, so that we give the best care to our patients. And the one thing I've really noticed in my town, and I've been the most surprised by this, is most of my specialists really have taken to it quite well, because they know I'm more involved in my patient's care, and they seem to take a higher percentage of time to actually communicate with me. I mean, I get text, phone calls from specialists quite frequently on things that I don't believe that I ever got text or called on when I was doing traditional primary care. My patients usually are more involved in their own care, because I do believe no matter what, you need to be your own advocate. You need to be educated. I do feel like that's part of my job, is to educate my patients. Hopefully they take that ball and run with it and educate themselves as well, but educate in a proper way. That's what I used to always get so frustrated with, is they would educate themselves, but it was really Uncle Ted that educated them, who didn't know anything, versus, the internet's great, right? But you have to use it properly. As I always say, we can research anything and nearly find I don't know, something that backs up every kooky thought. But are we using good, dependable sites to get our information from, or are we off in forums and things like that, which sometimes forums can be good. Most of the time, I don't think they are. So those are just kind of some of the things I notice in my practice.
I find it interesting. You think about that. The kind of medicine you're talking about, there's this reactive model. Oh my gosh, we got an emergency. Now we should start talking when it's almost too late, right? And then there's the proactive, where even the patient's involved, like spending more time with the physician, taking responsibility for what they own in their lifestyle that is impacting the outcome. But what's really interesting, I didn't know this, is that by you practicing the proactive version, other physicians in your community are starting to take advantage of the opportunity to discuss something that maybe other doctors are too busy trying to argue with the insurance company, instead of powwowing with the other physicians.
Yeah, and actually, that's why a lot of physicians down my community I think I've said this on a prior podcast. I went from a highly respected traditional primary care physician in town to kind of the kooky guy for a little while, to back to, gosh, I think he might actually be out in front with some of his thoughts, and now actually treating a decent number of physicians in my community as patients, and actually them referring their patients to our practice. And so we've kind of, had that wave of, different opinions. And I think one of the big things I tell I actually would tell this to patients and providers. If you're going to get upset by what others think of how your thoughts go, then we're not the practice for you. If you don't care what others think, if you are only concerned about what your thoughts are, or your education level tells you, and you're concerned about your true health as you age, then, this type of medicine is probably for you. A great example of what you talked about, and there's a doctor I really like, Dr. Lufkin, that I like to follow. And he was talking about, and actually just you and I talked about it before we popped on. I was writing a newsletter for an organization on weight loss, or the inability to lose weight, I guess I should say. And, it's all about insulin, as we talked about, hyperinsulinemia, elevated fasting insulin levels. But our traditional model not only doesn't check fasting insulin levels, they don't even consider that a disease. The disease is when you become a diabetic in the United States. And, we know that there's so many stages before actually becoming a diabetic that we could have caught it, we could have intervened, we could have changed these person's lives. We can still do a lot of work even when they do become a type 2 diabetic, but why do we need to wait till that point? Again, I know I'm kind of going off the topic a little bit, but I had one of my physician's assistants that used to work for me, who's now a patient, was in my office on Friday, and I said, man, I was laughing, but not really laughing. I was like, I'm so disappointed in myself early on in my career, because the basic labs that I did, it was so basic, like, but I try not to blame myself, because it was just what I knew. But, I look at it and go, God, I could have helped so many people, just by checking. Is what I said in my newsletter today, something that's inexpensive and so easy to check, a fasting insulin level, because those blood sugars will stay normal for an extremely long period of time for most, but the insulin level is rising as insulin resistance is getting worse and worse. And then finally the dam breaks, and oh my God, I didn't see this coming, Steve. You're now a diabetic, and that's what the primary care physician will say. And there actually was a study many years ago that shows the average patient has been a diabetic for 5 years before they're diagnosed. How long were they insulin resistant? Like, it's probably a decade-long process that we're completely ignoring in the traditional model. So, yes, no, I completely agree that for the most part, your doctors aren't talking. They're independently prescribing different modalities, which for them they think is the best thing that they can do for their patients, which I'm not disputing that notion. I just think it's really important that you have that. The primary care physician is always touted as the quarterback of the team. They're the gatekeeper, the quarterback of the team. Those are a couple of analogies that are used. But it is our job to, in my opinion, it is our job to make sure that all these different treatment modalities work together, that they don't overlap, that they don't interfere with each other. And just in that traditional model, most of the time, the providers are overworked. They just don't have the time to truly pay that kind of attention to these different things that are happening. Same way with the specialist, right? Like there's a few concierge specialists, not very many. Most are in the traditional model. Most of your cash pay practices are going to be more primary care, age management based. So, again, I think that's where the importance of doing something like we do becomes more important, is so that we can watch just to make sure that the cardiologist and pulmonologist aren't doing things that maybe are kind of in a weird way butting heads with each other.
Yeah, I'm just thinking while you're talking, I have a marketing agency, and then there are other folks that are just as legitimate and experienced. But even if you had us meet and brainstorm a project, we would have conflicting opinions, or we may want to, to begin a certain strategy, and the other side wouldn't. And I can imagine that exists in the medical community.
Yeah, a perfect scenario is actually where specialists make recommendations, and then you bring those back to my office, and the patient and I go over those recommendations and determine together. Ultimately, the patient is always the deciding factor. I always tell them they're the captain of their own ship. We're just their first mate. We're trying to help them make proper decisions. So I would kind of use the analogy that you go out and get these great opinions and then we bring them back. And just like if I was consulting with 3 marketing firms, lots of ideas are brought to the table. Ultimately, it's the company owner's job to pick which they think is the best options for them. Same way with patients, but many times these, and rightfully so, sometimes decisions have to be made right there in the office. I don't know, if the cardiologist thinks you're about to have a heart attack, it's like, no, we need to do this today. But many times, these are decisions, like I think I've told you before, I have an amazing cardiologist here in town who actually will, if I see something in the office, I can text him and if the patient will be patient with me, he'll actually FaceTime me, like while the patient's in my office, and he's done that many times, and be like, hey, with the patient in the room, and like, hey, doc has said this, I think we should, I think that's right. Or, hey, let's try this and come follow up in my office next month. And I get that quite frequently with a lot of my local specialists. Now, when I send them to a specialist in Dallas or someone that I don't have an intimate relationship with, it's not quite as good as that goes. And that's why I try to always guide my patients to my handful of handpicked specialists, that we like to use for those exact reasons.
So I was one of those patients that was going to be diagnosed with diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily the physician I was meeting with was doing those deep labs,
mm-hmm.
and was able to determine my pancreas was working overtime over a period of labs, maybe, several months and several quarters. And that was like really convincing to me that there was something in my lifestyle I needed to address, or I was going to have to manage this issue differently.
Yeah, no doubt.
And that's something that when you're talking about having these conversations with the patient, it helped me decide I need to take ownership. And what am I doing that's running this pancreas so hard? Well, you're eating too much. What you're eating is causing your pancreas to work so hard. So then I had to adjust, and I was able to work with that physician at that time.
Yeah, and that's the exact type of patients we're looking for, right? And I do acknowledge that, unfortunately, not all patients are motivated enough to, as crazy as it sounds, not all patients are motivated enough to actually put their health first. They choose just, oh, doc, give me the pill that's going to make this problem go away, which actually isn't true. It's not going to make it go away. It's just going to control the situation for a bit longer. As I talked to another provider kind of new to this industry a while back, and I said, they were talking about how they felt like there weren't be that many people interested in this type of medicine. And I said, well, you're kind of right, but the good news is we're not looking for a huge number. That's the whole reason we're doing this, is we don't want to see 30 patients a day, because then we're back to that same model of having 15 minutes a patient, and we can't take care of these people. They were like, oh yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way. We're looking for that 1% to 2% of the patient population who really wants to take their health into their hands. But I think it's a very much a growing percentage of our population that's looking at health this way, with all of the different blogs and social media and things out there. And as much as some of it drives me crazy, I do think there is momentum and movement for patients looking at their own bad habits, because yeah, we can get away with a lot of that stuff when we're young, but as we get older, we can't. But even with that being said, I know we've talked about this before on a podcast. I'm seeing an extremely high number of teenagers now with hyperinsulinemia, because the diets are so bad, and we had that in our own household. I think I've even talked about it with my son, and who has autism. And luckily with our interventions, it's been reversed. But his insulin level was through the roof, and blood sugars were actually starting to elevate. And why is that? I mean, he's a 17-year-old kid, because the American diet has become so poor. Processed foods, GMOs, genetically modified foods, sugar, carbs. I mean, there's just, what our schools feed our kids today, the options, now like where our kids go to school, they literally cater in fast food on a daily basis. They literally feed them, chicken strips and fries and a soda for lunch. It's just, you could get away with that as a kid for maybe one of your meals, but when breakfast starts with donuts and orange juice, and lunch is chicken strips and soda, and dinner's some version of the same thing, and snacks, and you're just overloading that pancreas to the point to where it's screaming even at 16, 17, 18 years old. And we're now seeing an alarming rate of diabetes type 2 and our teenagers to early 20 somethings, which is just not something I saw early on in my practice. We were mainly dealing with the 40 something year old who was starting to deal with insulin resistance. Well, again, I didn't really catch insulin resistance. I caught diabetes. Just when that 90-day blood sugar, the A1C, actually, hell, let's go back. We didn't even do A1Cs routinely when I came into medicine. We just looked at fasting blood sugars, and if they were elevated, then we started checking those things. And even the parameters on insulin or fasting sugars is quite varied. What a lot of people call normal, we don't. And so again, we always talk about what's optimal and what's normal. Those are two different things. Normal is kind of an A+ to C- range, and optimal is kind of like that A to A+ range. And so that's what we strive for, because we know that with many times it takes nothing more than getting our patients moving, getting their hormones balanced, and get them to eat reasonably better. I don't talk to my patients about perfect diets. I never do, because I don't have one. I personally do not have a perfect diet, but I have a reasonable diet. And if we do reasonable, most of the time we'll do well, because very few people will do anything perfectly long term. We're just not perfect beings. And so, but we can talk about how let's not eat tortillas with every meal. Let's maybe, slow that down to once or twice a week. And those little changes make big differences long term.
Yeah, that's what those labs convinced me of what my ownership was. And then it wasn't like a cold turkey thing. It was just not eating, just only eating from, noon to 6, noon to
Fasting,
7.
intermittent fasting.
Yeah. And then trying to avoid some of the white foods, potatoes, chips. Chips are yellow. Well, there's white.
Well, here's what I always say: bread, rice, pasta, corn, and potatoes. If it's white when it started out and it wasn't cauliflower, it's probably not good for you. And so chips absolutely fit into that category. They're either corn or flour based, and so not good for you overall. But hey, like I told somebody the other day, you're gonna have chips occasionally. It's okay. I mean, I have found if I go into the room, and I started off like this when I went into age management, like no more this, that, and the other. And I realized very quickly, well, that's not the stance to have, especially if you can't do it yourself. But if you go and tell a guy, hey, I need you to try to limit these 5 foods, dabble in them occasionally, but not every single meal. Like, we just can't do that. You can't have biscuits for breakfast and a sandwich for lunch and, dinner rolls with dinner. Let's get rid of some of this bread. Let's quit drinking sodas. Oh my God, don't get me started on sodas. That is probably, I find patients easier to quit alcohol sometimes than sodas. And I just don't understand the attraction with sodas. I guess I've never been a huge soda drinker, although I did have a time with Diet Coke. But once I realized it was bad for me, I never thought twice about it. It was just not a big deal to give up. But some people really have issues giving up soda. You can make tremendous differences. Like, my son has maintained his insulin optimization and weight loss, and his diet's still not perfect. Right. But he has effectively given up soda. He does not drink it. Like, there's times where, like, hey, if you want to get a soda, you can. He's like, nah, I don't need soda. And he just doesn't drink soda anymore. And just taking that 400 or 500 calories a day out of his diet of pure sugar has made a tremendous difference. He'd have a couple of sodas a day of the larger ones, so let's just say 400 calories a day, 7 days a week, about 3,000 calories of pure sugar. It makes a difference, on a long-term basis on maintaining or losing fat.
I suspect, this is just my theory, I suspect the sodas, the scientists or the chemists they have are designing those flavors to be highly addictive because it's repeat sales, right?
Well,
Yeah.
it's mainly the sugar. Sugar is such an addictive substance, and I tell everybody my weakness is sugar. I don't drink soda, but I love candy, and I have to go cold turkey on candy because if I allow myself to have like a little bit here, a little bit there, hell, I'm pounding Sour Patch Kids like they're I don't know, whatever. So sugar is just such an addictive substance. We have this thought in America that we need sugar in our diet, which we do not. The best thing we can do is stay away from it, get it naturally in your diet, but not things that have sugar added in. It's very hard to do. But that's where that proper shopping, staying away from the bagged and boxed foods, staying with it, as we always say, living on the periphery of your grocery store, is the best thing you can do. I know we have to go down the aisles of the grocery store, but minimize it because they do a good job of sucking you in when you go down those aisles of, oh, I need that. Oh, I need that. There's no doubt that scientists, marketers, everybody's done a good job of causing our brains to want these things as we go down the aisles.
Well, speaking of causing our brains to want this thing, if someone's been listening to this conversation, they're interested in taking ownership of their health, how do you recommend that they engage with you?
Well, I think the easiest way is just go to our website, which is theresearchclinic.com. We have plenty of different places where you can click on the links to basically get in contact with us. You're also welcome to call us directly, 817-599-9902. But I feel like the website is really, at this moment in time, the easiest way to do that. We have a person that mans those leads on a daily basis. So we will get back with you if you put in any type of wanting information from us.
All right, Dr. Kris, another great conversation. I'm looking forward to our next. For those of you, the Dr. Kris Life podcast is on Buzzsprout, on YouTube. Go check it out, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next episode. Dr. Kris, have a happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, you too. Go ahead and let yourself go on Thanksgiving. I am.
Already have. Yeah. All right. We'll see you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining the Dr. Kris podcast. If you learned something today and you want to connect and get more information, visit our website, www.drkris.life, where you can find more great information or even schedule a time to learn how you can engage with Dr. Kris. Be sure to follow, like, share, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Dr. Kris podcast.